Hi, I'm Adam Porter and this is my board gaming vlog, and today I'm talking about 2017. So there's going to be a top 10 games of the year. I want to briefly talk about my favourite expansions of the year, but I'm going to start off with my highlight of the year, which predictably enough was this. So those are my two games that have been published this year, Doodle Rush and Big Bazaar. I'm going to say nothing more about them because you can look up reviews for them online. There have been lots of good reviews from the prominent sort of reviewers in the board game world, and you can find out more about them by looking back at my channel. But how exciting to get my first two games out onto the market. I also signed games with multiple other publishers, so I've got other games coming out in 2018, 2019, all signed and sort of ready to go now. So it's an exciting time for me as a designer. Let's get on to the games that weren't by me. So the first thing is the expansions, my favourite expansions of the year. So what you can see on the table there are three expansions, and they're three expansions for games that I really enjoy. The most essential of those three expansions is undoubtedly the Merry Men expansion for Sheriff of Nottingham, and I'm not overstating it when I say that that is an essential expansion. I would never play without it. Okay, Sheriff of Nottingham started out as a great game for me. I loved it, and then you'd get a player who would twig that actually they could often win the game by not really playing the game. And what I mean by that is Sheriff of Nottingham is a game all about lying to your mates, trying to sneak little bits of contraband past them in order to get the most valuable cards into your collection for endgame scoring. But if you just told the truth for the whole game, you could often win that way. And I've seen people try and tout this as a positive, but what it really means is that people just aren't playing the game. And it became such a frustrating experience to be trying to engage with all that lying and bribery while another player just doesn't engage with it at all, and then they go on and win. Sheriff of Nottingham Merry Men expansion changes all of that. It introduces these special orders, black market sort of orders, where you've got to get the illegal goods in, you've got to lie, you've got to cheat in order to win the game. It's got some nice little thematic touches like sneaking a merry man into your sack and then getting them past the sheriff, revealing them, and then their special power happens, you know, and you get all this great sort of comeback from it. So it's a really nice little expansion with several different modules, and you can pick and choose which of those modules you want to use. The Dream Home expansion, I'm not going to talk too much about that. It's a very simple one, adds a nice little element of set collection to the game, not really adding any complexity, but that game didn't need it. It's a nice family game from last year, and it's nice to just have some extra stuff to do in the game. The Journeyman expansion for Isle of Skye adds a lot of complexity to the game. Isle of Skye was a fantastic game from a couple of years ago, and it was sort of mid-weighted. You know, it wasn't for beginners, but it wasn't a complex game. Well, now it is a fairly complex game, a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking involved. I must admit I haven't actually played this one yet. I'm struggling to get it to the table just because it's a bit heavier than the sort of games I would normally play, but it looks really clever and really fun, and so I'm looking forward to getting to playing it. So let's get on to the top 10 games of the year from my point of view. And I'm going to say here, my tastes are light, okay? They're lighter than the majority of the other YouTubers that I watch. I tend towards party games, light games, family games, dice games, trick-taking games, this sort of thing. What I do not like is episodic games. I don't like scenarios-based games where I have to play with the same group over and over again and commit to playing that game over a long period. So you're not going to see Pandemic Legacy Season 2 on this list, and you're not going to see Gloomhaven or anything of its ilk. I don't play long games, or not very often. I tend to play things that are fairly short, fairly simple, where we can get a few games done in an afternoon or an evening. I like playing with, you know, my friends and their kids and their partners, and keep it really light and sort of simple sort of stuff. That said, I think there's some really interesting games in my top 10 games. I haven't by any means played all the games that came out this year. In fact, I haven't played that many compared to previous years. But that's because I've been getting a little bit more selective, and I can spot now that's a game that wouldn't interest me. Now, it doesn't mean it wouldn't interest you or anybody else, but some of the heavier strategy type games, I just haven't really considered them for this list. So with all that said, let's get stuck into my top 10 games of 2017. each round in Cortex Challenge, one player will turn over the top card from the deck and all players try and solve the puzzle indicated on the card. When a player has found the answer, they put their hand onto the card and then they give their answer. If they're correct, they take the card for scoring, but if they're incorrect, they lose the card and they cannot give an answer in the next round. When a player has got 2 cards of the same puzzle type in front of them, they gain a brain piece, and the first player to collect 4 brain pieces wins the game. The puzzles are memory. So the first one is a player has to describe all the items on the card without looking. The second one is maze. A player must declare which exit is the way out of the maze. Number 3 is colour. A player must state which word is written in its own colour. Number 4 is coordination, so a player must place the indicated fingers onto the indicated part of their face. Number 5 is duplicates, where the player must declare which of the illustrations on the card is repeated. Number 6 is frequency, where a player must declare which side of the dice appears most often on the card. Number 7, reasoning. The player must declare which shape fits into the missing slot. And then number 8 is the touch challenge, where a player must feel a raised texture onto a card without looking at it, and then declare what picture they think they're feeling. Now this is one of those very simple little games where I played it and I thought, I wish I'd thought of that. I get that every now and then, particularly when I'm playing these super light speed type games. Why didn't I think of that? It's such an obvious idea, so accessible, everybody can understand it, everybody can join in. You're not going to be playing this over and over again for you know, you're going to get through those puzzles pretty quickly, you're going to get a bit tired of them. But what they've done since is brought out multiple new versions of Braintopia or Cortex Challenge with different themes for different age groups and things like this. For me, I've still only got that basic set, and so it's something that I'll pull off the shelf every few months or so, just as a little warm-up, just to play for 10 minutes while we're waiting for people to arrive, that sort of thing. But it's a really good one. I love that tactile thing where we have to rub the card to sort of see see if you can work out which card it is just by feeling it. All the different puzzles. Some people are good at the memory one. Some people are good at that Stroop effect one, where you've got to say the colour, but not the you've got to say which colour is written in the correct colour, and the mind-bending sort of stuff. But it's really good. It's really well produced, and I like it a lot. In CrossTalk, the players separate into 2 teams. Each team will have a clue giver for each round of the game, and the 2 clue givers draw a card and determine a shared keyword which they will both try and put across to their teams. A team wins the round if they guess the keyword before the other team. Each clue giver writes a private, one-word clue and they pass it secretly to their own teammates. The clue givers then alternate giving public clues, which both teams can see. The twist here is that after a clue giver gives a public clue, the opposing team gets the first guess at the answer. So the clues should really relate to the previously given private clue in order to hopefully throw your opponents off the scent. Experienced players will want to also use the hint board, where once per round the clue giver can give a selection of hints to their team, telling them to ignore certain clues or combine certain clues or to look for a synonym for the word they've given, etc. And when one team achieves 5 correct guesses, they win the whole game. So my number 9 is CrossTalk. Now CrossTalk is an interesting party game, and I think that's the best way to describe it. It's really interesting. It's not as accessible as some of the other party games like Codenames and the other big sort of successes. It's quieter, it's more cerebral. Codenames was always best with 6 players because there you've got one clue giver and then you've got the 2 team members who can discuss their ideas between themselves. You can't even do that in CrossTalk. You can't discuss between yourselves because the other team would hear and they're trying to guess the same word as you. So instead we resort to writing on little boards and showing them to each other. Now that is fun, but it is quiet and it is a bit thinky. The other thing is that this is a game that swings massively. You can have a really good round where it goes on for a while and people are really psyching each other out, and the 2 clue givers are they're sort of playing this mental game of chess with each other, and everyone's trying to read each other, and that's fantastic when it happens. But you also get these rounds where first clue, somebody gets it and the round sort of falls apart, and basically one of the clue givers hasn't really had a proper go because the other team have got it too quickly, just because the clues that have been given, usually the secret clues by the two clue givers, have got such synergy, they're such similar sort of clues, that both, you know, that you give one clue and the other team gets it, basically because they've got all the information available to them. So there's some frustrations in the game, but it is a very clever idea. It's nicely produced and I'm very happy to play it every now and then. I don't think it's going to be a classic party game that's going to be remembered for years and years and years like Codenames appears to be, but it's well worth taking a look at if you're getting a little bit, you know, you've kind of done Codenames and you're looking for something similar. It's different enough that it is well worth playing and owning both. In Yamatai, each player is trying to score victory points on a pretty board. Honestly, there's some backstory in the rulebook, but this is basically what it amounts to. On a player's turn, they first select a tile, which will give them a reward and determine player order for the next round. They can then buy or sell a single boat. The third thing a player may do on their turn is place boats onto the board in an uninterrupted chain. The first boat in the chain must match the colour of the adjacent boat or be placed on a designated starting spot. Thereafter, the colour of the boats is not limited. A player must then collect tokens from the islands on the board, 1 token per adjacent ship that you've placed, or build. Placing a building requires the island that you're building on to be surrounded by a specified selection of coloured boats. When a building is placed, the player gains points or coins depending on what it's adjacent to, and they take a tile for endgame scoring. Finally, a player may spend their tokens to recruit a specialist, which gives them rule-breaking abilities. The game ends when a player places their last building, or boats of one colour have run out, or the specialist or building decks have run out. And the player with the most points from coins, tokens, buildings and special abilities wins. Number 8 on the list is a very different sort of game. This is Yamatai. Yamatai is Bruno Catala, and there's another designer as well. Who's the other designer? Mark Paquien. I'm not familiar with that designer. This was sort of touted as a follow-up to 5 Tribes, which was another Days of Wonder game by Bruno Catala, a heavier sort of one. Often got criticised for the change in the board state happening so much. Every turn, so much would change that you really couldn't plan ahead. So it was a game that was prone to players sitting and reading the board for minutes at a time on their turn. So ran very, very slow and very, very long if you played it with that sort of player. Now, Yamatai has done nothing to address that. Yamatai, the decision space is enormous. You've got so many different options that you can do, so much to read on the board and work out that it can really bog down and slow down. There's also a weird turn order thing where you're selecting turn order, which means that you could go first in one round and then go fourth in another round, which means that you've then got essentially 8 turns before it gets back round to you. So there's quite a lot of downtime potentially in the game. The theme doesn't really come into it at all. These are all criticisms that I could aim at the game, and yet I really, really enjoy it. And that's because the puzzle just kind of makes sense to me. It's one of those ones. It's one of those things where a game just clicks with you, where you can kind of it just feels right. It just feels like a puzzle that I can work with. I understand the mechanics of the game. I can win the game, not every time, but I can win the game. I can't say that for every game. I had a similar experience with a game called Grand Austria Hotel last year. A game that really clicked with me, but not with every group that I played with. And funnily enough, another game with a weird turn order thing with loads of downtime. But Yamatai hasn't clicked with everybody that I've played it with, and it hasn't clicked with everybody that I've seen talking about it online. But I love it, and I've played it with other players who have really enjoyed it too. So it's not one I'd recommend to everybody, but if you like the aesthetics of it, if you like Bruno Catala's other games, and the overview looks interesting to you, I would recommend trying it out. I think it's gone a little bit under the radar. In London, on a player's turn, they first draw 1 city card, either from the board or from the deck. They then take 1 action. The first action they could take is to place 1 or more cards in front of them to develop their city. In order to add a card, they've first got to discard a card of the same colour from their hand onto the board, and sometimes they pay an additional cost if that's indicated on the card. The second action available to them is to instead buy land. This means taking one of the 3 face-up borough cards and paying its cost. This gives you an immediate benefit, and often it gives you an ongoing ability. The third available action is to run your city. This means you pay the activation cost of each card in the city that you wish to use, you gain its benefits and its effects. Many cards will often then flip face down so they can't be used again, but some remain face up. The player then receives poverty tokens for each stack of cards in their city, for each loan they've taken out, and for each card that they have in their hand. The final available action for a player is to instead simply draw 3 cards. The game ends when the city deck runs out, and players then gain poverty for each card they have left in their hand. They then score points from the cards in their cities, pay back any loans if possible, and lose points for unpaid loans, and then they compare their poverty levels to each other, and all except the player with the fewest poverty lose points. The player with the most points wins. Number 7 on my list is a bit of a cheat because it's a second edition. It's London's second edition, and the reason I've allowed it onto the list is because it's so different to the earlier version of London from what I've read. There are significant changes to it, and not just in terms of the aesthetics, which are hugely overhauled and very, very beautiful, but also in terms of the gameplay itself. Now, this is the first time I've played the game. I hadn't played it previously, and Martin Wallace is hitting on all cylinders for me. He had an amazing year last year. I really loved Hit Z Road, and I really liked Via Nebula, which was my game of the year last year, my number 1 of my top games of 2016. Well, London's second edition feels every bit as current as those games, even though it's based on a much, much older system. It is a thinkier, heavier sort of strategy game. There's some complexity there. It's punishing. The poverty system where you're constantly gaining poverty, I mean constantly gaining poverty, and trying to deal with it. Some players aren't going to like that. If you don't like the system in Agricola, which a lot of people will have played, where you've got to feed your workers all the time, and if you don't, you take great penalties in terms of points, then you're not going to like the poverty system in London. It's brutal. I don't mind that sort of stressing games. I like to know I've got to keep on top of that. It gives me something to drive towards. I know what my strategies are. Cut back on the poverty, pull back on the poverty, don't let it get out of hand, or ignore the poverty and work on something else. It gives me some sort of something to drive for. And so I've really enjoyed London. It's got some interesting, unique mechanisms, things I haven't seen before in games. Yeah, it's a great one to check out if you like sort of medium to heavier strategy Euro games. In Star Wars Destiny, each player selects a team of characters from their collection. They're limited to 30 points, which generally means using 2 to 4 characters per team. And each character has a card with special abilities and a custom die. The different sides of the die generally show things like melee damage, ranged damage, forcing an opponent to discard a card or to lose a resource, or to allow you to manipulate your own dice or to gain resources for yourself. Once a player has their team of characters sorted, they need to construct a deck, again using cards from their collection. There are some limitations of what can go into your deck based on the colour of the characters you've chosen and the allegiance of the characters, so are they good or are they evil? And in each round of the game, all players have 5 cards in their hand. On their turn, they can take 1 action. This might be to activate a character, thereby rolling all of their dice. Note that the dice don't resolve automatically. That would require another action. This delay allows the opponent time to disrupt your plans, removing or re-rolling your dice through their own actions. Another common action is to play a card, which can have all manner of different effects, bolstering existing powers, introducing new support dice, weapons or abilities, or simply manipulating the current state of play. Each card has a resource cost to play, so resources need to be managed carefully. A player can always discard cards from their hand in order to re-roll their own dice, but care must be taken because running out of cards in your deck is one way to lose the game. But the more common route to victory is by reducing your opponent's characters to 0 hit points. Of course, the game features an endless supply of rule-breaking cards, dice, and characters. Number 6, if you've watched my channel before, you may well find this a bit of a surprising inclusion on the list. And it's the first time I've ever delved into a collectible game with random boosters. I've never played Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon or anything like that. But Star Wars Destiny, I got dragged in by my friend who is, I think it's fair to say, a little obsessed with Star Wars. He wanted someone to play it with. It was a dice game. I love dice games. It was a fairly cheap starter set. We played it together. I liked it. I said, yeah, I'll buy in. I'll get some of it. I never intended to get as much as I ended up with. So when I say I've never delved into a collectible game with random boosters before, I now see what it's all about. It's addictive, isn't it? Buying that stuff, opening it. What am I going to get? Am I going to get the thing that I want? If I don't get the thing that I want, am I going to go out and buy more boosters and open more packets? Or am I going to go online and pay an absolute fortune just to buy a dice and a card? No, I'll open some more boosters. So you open some more boosters, and now there's 5 things that you want because this would go really well with this, and this would go really well with this. So I go and I buy some more boosters. And every time I walk into the board game shop, I'm going to buy something else. I'm just having a look around the shelves maybe. Do you know, those boosters, they're only £3. I could probably buy one of those. But one's not much fun, is it? So let's buy 2 or 3 or 4. And so the collection blooms, blossoms, grows, explodes. And that, I don't know whether I can recommend that to people. It feels irresponsible, the amount of money that I've spent on it, that my friend has spent on it. I mean, it's not that I can't afford to do it. It's just, I don't know, I spent more money on that game this year than on any other game. And probably there's not many games that I've spent that much money on. And is it good enough to warrant that? Well, it is a really, really good game. It's a really good dice game. I don't generally like games with lots of conflict. I don't like games where I'm building something and then other people break it down. But I don't mind that if it's a head-to-head, if that's the whole point of the game. I don't mind it in my favourite game, Evolution, which has a similar sort of feel actually to Star Wars Destiny. That idea of having your basic starting point, adding cards and abilities to it, attacking each other, trying to take their abilities off them. I think it's a good game, really good. I think it's, I mean, a lot of the game is played on your own, building your deck before you even meet up with your mates. That bit I find difficult. I'm not sure I'm terribly good at it, but there are ways around that. I mean, my friend and I have started now playing that after we play a game, we swap decks and we play with the other person's characters to see how we get on, so that there's no longer that sort of limitation of, oh, he's better at building a deck than me, or he's got better cards than me in his collection, because we're going to play it both ways. And as it turns out, he beats me both ways, which suggests that my deck building isn't the problem, it's actually how I play the game. But it's a nice game. If you like dice games and if you like Star Wars, I mean, it's fun, just the theme of it, isn't it? Looking at those pictures, which characters do you get? You know the characters. The iconography is good. It's a fairly simple system. I really like it, Star Wars Destiny. In the 2-player game Tokyo Highway, each player has a collection of roads, pillars, junctions, and cars. The aim of the game is to be the first to get rid of all of your cars. On a player's turn, they place a new road. They do this by first positioning a pillar. It must have a height either 1 above their previous pillar or 1 below it. They may never touch the opponent's roads or pillars. If a player's road crosses their opponent's road, and importantly, no other roads are already crossing it, then the player can place a car onto the road. And equally, if a player places their road under an opponent's road, and no other roads are under it, then they can place a car. With really clever positioning, sometimes a player can place 2 or 3 cars in a single turn by putting their road under and over several of the opponent's roads in a single move. Junctions allow you to vary the height of your pillars without restriction, and they also allow you to branch off in different directions, but you only have 3 of these, so use them sparingly. If any roads are knocked over during construction, they're rebuilt and the careless player gives pillars to their opponent as a penalty. The game ends when one player uses their final car. In this case, they win. Or the game could also end when one player runs out of pillars. And in this case, they lose. Number 5 on my list is probably the most obscure game on the list, the one that's going to be hard to get hold of. It's called Tokyo Highway, and it is a strange sort of dexterity game with aspects of sort of abstract strategy, positioning aspects to it. So it's not just about do you have steady hands, it's also about if I position there, will he position there? And then maybe I could go there. So planning a few moves ahead and that sort of outmaneuvering each other, working out when you're going to come in and try and cut over the roads or under the roads. It's quite a thinky, quite a quiet, abstract strategy game. It's compared to the dexterity games, this is by far the most thinky, quiet one that I own. But you build such a beautiful structure when you're playing the game. The whole thing looks great, and then when it collapses, it has the hilarity of a simple game like Super Rhino. And yet the decisions in it are meatier. There are actual decisions, real thought that goes into it. I think it's a clever game. The rules are simple, but there are strategies in there. It looks great. It's a nice package, attractively produced. I think if you can get hold of a copy, I think it's a really good 2-player game. Again, not for everybody. Some people are going to find this frustrating. People with big, clumsy hands are going to find this frustrating. People who don't like that sort of thinking several turns ahead, they're going to find it frustrating. So it's not going to be for everybody. But for that small subset of people who like abstract strategy and attractive games and dexterity games, this is a perfect one. In Barenpark, each player is building their own zoo, which is populated only by bears and koalas, which are not bears. On a player's turn, they place a tile from their supply onto their own player board. If this covers an icon, they then collect a tile from the central board corresponding to that icon and place it into their supply. If they cover several icons, they will gain several tiles on their turn. No tile can be placed over the pit, and if a board is entirely filled except for the pit, then a bear statue is placed into it, scoring points. And the statues reduce in value as more are taken, so there's a race to get the boards filled quickly and score the highest points. If a construction crew is covered, then a new board is added to a player's park, and once 4 boards are completely filled in a single player's park, then the game ends and points are counted. Players score points for each tile on their board and for achieving variable goals, for example, having 3 polar bear tiles or 6 green areas, etc. The deck for each tile type is limited, and the highest scoring tiles sit at the top, so the entire game is based around beating your opponents in the race for the highest scoring tiles. Number 4 on the list, and this is the first of the games. There are 4 games on this list which I would say are instant classics. I think these games will be around for years, talked about for years. I mean, I can't say that they're games that everybody should have in their collection necessarily, and I'll come on to that with some of the later entries. But I think they're brilliant, brilliant designs. And the first of these is Barenpark. Barenpark takes everything that was fun about Uwe Rosenberg's Patchwork, Patchwork being a 2-player tile-laying game with Tetris-type pieces, and turns it into a 4-player game. In doing so, it actually manages to make the game simpler. The gameplay is so simple. There's barely any rules to it, and yet really interesting decisions every turn about positioning, about racing to beat the other players to the best pieces. The game looks beautiful. It's got quite a difficult sort of setup. It is a game that takes a little while to set up, and that's quite frustrating. But this is really a game you can play with anybody, and endlessly expandable. I hope there'll be expansions for this. I think it's a really clever, sweet, intelligent game. Phil Walker Harding, who designed this, is hitting on... he's really doing a good job over the last few years with Emotep and Sushi Go and Cacao, and now this. This is a designer that anything he produces, I'm going to look out for. So Barenpark, I can't speak highly enough about it. I think it's a great, great game. In Dice Forge, each player has 2 dice and an inventory where they can keep track of any resources, gold and points they've gathered. On a player's turn, all players roll their 2 dice simultaneously and add any resources or points rolled onto their inventories. And the player whose turn it is now purchases cards from the display, which cost resources but give special abilities and victory points, or they can purchase new sides for their dice. The dice are adjusted immediately by clicking off the existing sides and replacing them with new improved sides. Purchasing new sides for dice costs gold. If a player decides to purchase cards from the display, they place their pawn into the space by their chosen card, and if a pawn is already there, that pawn is returned to its owner, who then receives a reward. Basically, they get to immediately re-roll their 2 dice and gather the appropriate resources. The game ends after 9 or 10 rounds, depending on player count, by which time players are going to be generating massive amounts of resources each turn from their improved dice and purchasing the high-scoring cards, which cost many resources. The highest score at the end of the game wins. Number 3 on the list is Dice Forge. So Dice Forge is a strange game. It's innovative. It's not the first game that has done this idea of snapping new sides onto different dice. Other games have done it. The Lego games have done it before, and the game, what was it called? Was it Rattlebones? I can't remember. There's a game previously that had a similar sort of mechanism, but this is the first one that's really made it work and made it into an interesting strategy game. It feels very much like a deck building game. A deck building game being a game where you collect cards and you create a deck throughout the game, and your deck gets better and better. The difference here is that if you're adding sides onto a dice, so let's say I have a regular dice and I add an extra 6 on it, so now it's got 2 6s on it. Well, there's still a chance that I'm never going to roll that 6. So unlike a deck building game where I'm always going to, once I work all my way through that deck, at some point that special card, expensive card that I bought is going to come out. That's not the case in Dice Forge. My 6 might never come out, or it might come out every single turn for the rest of the game. So this is a game that feels a little bit more luck based than those deck builders. There is strategy in it, there certainly is, but it is quite swingy, it is quite luck based. I don't mind that. I enjoy it. I enjoy dice rolling. I love the aesthetic of the game. I love the tactile nature of clipping the pieces onto the side. There are clever luck mitigation aspects in it. The insert in the game is the best insert I've ever seen, and the game is very affordable for what you get in the box. I think it's a very, very clever, interesting, beautiful starting point for a system, and I hope that it sells well enough that it will start to get expansions, because I think with expansions it could get really interesting as a game system. It's going to turn some people off because of the swinginess of it, because of the fiddliness of kind of flicking these pieces off and losing these pieces and everything like that. It does feel like something that when you get it out, you're like on edge, like are these things going to get lost as they sort of fly across the room? But I would recommend this to. I've played this with fairly with kids of about 8 or 9 up to and certainly adults can have fun with the game. It's not a complex thing, but there are nice decisions in there, and it plays in a fairly short time frame too. So Dice Forge, another fantastic game from Libelud. In the cooperative game Magic Maze, the players are trying to get a team of heroes out of a shopping mall. Although there are 4 heroes, they're not owned by any specific player. Any player can move any hero. Instead, each player has a limitation on how they can move the heroes. So one player can only move heroes north, one player can only move them south, one player moves west and one moves east, one player can open doors and reveal new tiles, another player can use escalators. A timer is flipped over and players start moving heroes freely, as often as they wish, bearing in mind their limitations of movement. They're attempting to get the heroes onto a matching coloured symbol and then get out of a matching coloured exit, and this isn't easy. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that the players are not allowed to speak to each other. That's right, the game is played in silence. Players may, however, indicate to another player that they need their help by placing a large red wooden pawn in front of them. They cannot say what they need them to do. The red pawn just means do something. There are areas of the board where the team can flip the timer over and discuss strategy, but generally the game lasts for a frantic 15 minutes, after which players will have all won together or all lost together. Number 2 on the list is the Spiel des Jahres nominee for last year, Magic Maze. Now this one really took me by surprise. It's a real-time cooperative game, and I don't generally like real-time cooperative games. The ones that I've played before I've struggled a bit with, but this one, the rules are so simple. It can be frustrating for some players. People can get shut out of it. You've got to be confident getting in there. People are going to get, you're not allowed to talk to each other, but people will be tapping the pawn there to try and that wooden piece to try and get you to take an action. And people can get quite aggressive with that, which can put people, whoa, hang on. You know, you're because you're not allowed to speak, you feel you have to, right, I'm really going to emphasise this now, which means banging that piece on the table. So it can get a little raucous, it can get a little bit frenzied. But the game is so clever. The fact that I don't control the heroes that are on the board, I can control any of them. Everybody can control any of them. But I'm only allowed to move them in one certain direction. And actually, as you continue through the game, that changes which direction I can move them in, switches up throughout the game. So the whole thing is constantly in flux. And then there's like 20 different scenarios in the rule book just to increase the complexity of the game. And I haven't even got the expansion yet, so I don't even know what that adds. It's a brilliant design and really, really unique and interesting, and I would say at this point it's the best real-time cooperative game that I've played. I would say it beats Escape Curse of the Temple in that which was previously, you know, the big sort of poster child for this genre of game. So Magic Maze, if you don't mind something very frantic, very short, then I think this is a lot of fun, and I can definitely recommend Magic Maze. In Untold, Adventures Await, players work together to tell a story in a 5-act structure, inspired by rolling story cubes. These are dice with icons which can be interpreted however you wish. Players begin by answering a few questions about their chosen setting and writing some notes. They need to decide things like, is this past, present or future? Where does the story take place and what is the tone? Is it comedy, fantasy or high drama? A tile is flipped to represent a dangerous dilemma. Players select story cubes to place onto the tile, inspiring a location and a threat. The tile dictates whether the threat is attacking, or capturing, or pursuing, or accusing someone or something. Players now create their characters. Again, they're filling out a short sheet and they're answering some questions. They re-roll and use the cubes to inspire them in this. The board indicates that players can now collectively ask 4 questions about the scene and take 4 actions. If they ask a question, they take a question token, they re-roll the cubes and they use them to answer the question. If a player takes an action, they take an action token and they declare what they're trying to achieve. They then turn over a card to indicate yes, a success, no, a failure, yes and, which is an incredible success, yes but, which is success but with a price, no and, which is disastrous failure, or no but, which is unsuccessful but with an upside. They may also be required to turn over a reaction card, which shows the emotional impact on any one character of their choice. And once all actions and question tokens have been taken, players turn over the next tile, called the Plot Thickens. The cubes are placed to represent an evil ally or an evil master or a terrible secret or a dark agenda, and the tiles indicate whether this is linked to the previous threat or to the previous person or thing that was under threat. Players now ask questions and they take tokens, and then they move on to Act 3, which is called an unheroic undertaking, Act 4, which is the truth revealed, and then finally they wrap the story up in Act 5, the final showdown. Each time they're selecting cubes, they're asking questions and they're taking actions. Throughout the game, each player can play tokens from their own supply to add an idea to another player's suggestion, or to modify a roll of a cube, or to describe a flashback in time. They can also flip their play pause card to force a timeout where all players discuss the direction of the story and whether they feel engaged with it. When the story is complete, players write some notes and decide whether this is a one-off adventure or whether the characters and settings they've created will become part of a bigger campaign. And number one on the list I raved about in my recent Essen 2017 review, and that's the game Untold Adventures Await. Easily the best storytelling game that I've played, and I really want to like storytelling games, but I've struggled to find ones that really satisfy me. I don't like games that tell me a story. I'm not really interested in a narrative that is driven by the game itself. I'm not interested in reading flavour text and being told all about my character in great passages of text. I don't really care for that sort of narrative in games. But I do like narrative that is created by the players, and that's what Untold has in spades. Untold, you can create a story in any setting with any characters. Those Rory story cubes are a strange little component. They're so, in some ways they're so limiting, because although I've got, what have I got, 9 dice in a set of Rory story cubes with 6 images on them, so 54 different images. In actual fact, if I rolled the sheep, I'm never going to be able to roll the magnifying glass because it's on the same dice as the sheep, and so actually the combinations aren't that great. So you do see the same things over and over again when you're using Rory's story cubes as opposed to a deck of picture cards. But the great thing about Untold is that it forces you to reincorporate these images, but also a sheep doesn't always mean a sheep. If you're playing Untold, at the beginning of the game, before you even roll any dice, you decide on a setting. So you might decide on the Wild West, or you might decide that we're setting it on Mars, or on a movie set, or in a Tolkien-esque fantasy world, in which case that sheep icon is going to mean something different in every different setting. And that's where the game really comes into its own. You really can create worlds with this game, and I mean, you can play it as a single one-off game, which is probably realistically what I'm going to do, because as I've said before, I don't really like episodic games. But you can actually use this as like an RPG system where the same characters come back in multiple stories and you keep track of stuff, and yet it's so simple. It's simple enough for children and families to play. It's beautifully produced. I can't rave enough about Untold Adventures Await. It's not going to be for everybody. It requires a lot of creativity and imagination, and if you're not skilled at sort of reining things in, you can still end up telling these big meandering stories, where the problems with games like I, Dark Overlord and things and Once Upon a Time is that the stories can become really convoluted, and we start to step outside of, we're not reincorporating anything, and ideas just get lost and thrown away, and suddenly we've got, you know, we're on Mars, but suddenly there's a football World Cup happening, or something completely, you know, original, which doesn't actually fit the setting. People don't understand to kind of stay within that. I'm getting into improv speak here because I've got a bit of a history of doing improvised storytelling. But that circle of expectation where, you know, if we're on Mars, what we want to be dealing with is craters and meteors and aliens and robots and space stations, not, you know, donuts and armchairs, and, you know, that's the sort of problem that can happen with storytelling, is that people go off on these flights of fancy. And Untold does nothing really to deal with that. Okay, you still need players to rein it in and keep it tight. I'm hoping that I'll make a future video where I talk a little bit about improvised storytelling and try and give some tips and advice on how to manage that stuff. But with the players that I've played it with, we've had an absolute fantastic time. I love the game. I think it's by certainly the best game of 2017 is Untold Adventures Await. Okay, so thanks very much for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please watch some of my other videos. Please subscribe to my channel. I'm on Board Game Geek, I'm Adam78. On YouTube, I'm Adam's Board Game Wales. On Twitter, I'm @BoardGameWales. have a look at my games as well. I'd really like it if people took, had a look at Doodle Rush and Big Bazaar, and if you're interested, pick up a copy. Big Bazaar in particular is available everywhere. I think Doodle Rush is getting that way. I think it'll be a little bit more available in the early parts of 2018 in some areas, but either of them is a fantastic Christmas gift if you want to pick one up. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and all the best.